All right, Andra, we are rolling.
Wonderful. I'm so pleased to talk to you, Chris.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard your name around the industry for a while, so it's an honor to have you kicking off our program here. And, you were just leading a talk with various other ecosystem leaders within the robotic space. And I feel the only appropriate question to start, just to set a baseline for those that can't be here, are, what is a robotics cluster? Describe that as if we're, having a drink with one another, happy hour style.
Great. Well, a robotics cluster is the ecosystem that supports startups and larger companies. It supports them in enhancing their opportunities for success and their opportunities to scale. So this, regardless of whether a cluster's a not-for-profit or what are the details around its formation, this is our mission. Our primary mission is to support our local robotics clusters. And we tend to be our local robotics companies. And so we tend to be regional by nature. But one of the key strategies that we use to support the economic growth of robotics companies is to create partnerships that they can leverage for success. So we're all about collaboration as well. And because we're all about collaboration, collaborating with the other regional robotics clusters, in my case, I'm Silicon Valley Robotics, and the other two really major robotics clusters are Pittsburgh Robotics Network and Mass Robotics. So it's a no-brainer for us to collaborate because we each have our regions. But as companies grow, they may need the resources of each of our regions. And the companies, we encourage them to move from region to region, to be fluid. We want them to have every resource that they need for their growth. And we've formalized this now as the US Alliance of Robotics Clusters. And one of the reasons that we've formalized this is because we may be regional, but we know a lot about what is happening nationally. And we really are representing the face of the emerging robotics industry. And it's important that we advocate for the emerging robotics industry and that we advocate nationally as well as regionally. So we're coming together to do that and also to support emerging clusters in other regions. And we know that there are robotics companies forming all over the US, and they're not necessarily able to access a rich ecosystem, but they can access the ecosystems that are in other regions as well. We all have open door policies. And since the pandemic, I think we all recognize that virtual connections can be very valuable.
And one question I have is, you mentioned the different robotics networks, right? You've got Boston, you've got Silicon Valley, you've got Pittsburgh, and you were talking about each different region having strengths, right? I'd love to hear, as the managing director of Silicon Valley Robotics, what you feel the strengths of Silicon Valley are.
Our most obvious strength is that the investment community. We have the largest, densest community of investment. What's often overlooked, whereas Pittsburgh's strength comes a lot out of companies coming out of Carnegie Mellon and the groundbreaking work that they do. And Pittsburgh is focusing on autonomous vehicles because there's quite a specialty around that in this area. They're also focusing on manufacturing support because, again, it's a specialty of the area. Mass Robotics has both access to investment, but also a really good health and biotech infrastructure. So we each have certain strengths and certain things that we all have in common. And I would say that in Silicon Valley, you probably need to spend some time in the Valley, regardless of where your company's actually located, when you're going through your fundraising times, because we have the largest capital concentration in the world, honestly, the largest capital concentration in the world.
Absolutely. It's interesting. On Manufacturing Happy Hour, I feel like there was a time period not too long ago, really just this past year, where felt like every other company I was talking to had some connection to Silicon Valley. And there was a comment you made on stage. I'm going to try to quote you correctly. You talked about fashion trends in Silicon Valley, and I want to, as much of a tech podcast as this is, it's also a leadership podcast. I'd love to give leadership advice to, let's say, maybe some of the younger companies out there that are looking for funding. So you mentioned fashion trends in Silicon Valley. I think kind of like a flavor of the month for investors
Yes.
in terms of what they're into at the time.
Oh,
You know,
there's definitely fashion trends in investment. And one of the things you have to realize is that majority of successful investors out there have been software investors, and that's their background. That's
Sure.
what they know. They're not bringing much to the table when it comes to a hardware company, let alone a robotics company. Or even within that, companies that are doing sensor technology, sensor fusion. I would say, frankly, any deep tech or hardware company is not playing to the majority of investors' strengths. And that's the question that I encourage every startup founder to ask. Write down the list of qualities that you would like in your ideal investor. Write down the things that you need assistance with in your startup. Is it access to management talent? Is it access to market partners? What are the things that you want out of your investors? Because you've got to look at it as a partnership. They have to bring more to the table than money. And we saw a flood of capital in that was just money. And it has actually been a burden for those startups that took that money because they didn't get any of the extra benefits that they would have needed to grow into successful companies.
Yeah, like any relationship, it's a two-way street, right? And you need to make sure you're asking the right questions of your investors as they are of you as a young company. So, excellent advice. It
Yeah.
sounds like you wanted to add one other point to that.
I would say I've tried to explain venture capital to engineers in particular. So I think for the Manufacturing Happy Hour podcast, we're talking to engineers, and it is really, really hard for them to get it through their heads that venture capitalists fail and that they will invest in companies knowing that there's a good chance that the company is going to fail. Now, I'm not saying that they want that to happen, but they're okay with it. Whereas for you, it's your company. You want this one to succeed. Venture capital is playing a bets on the table game.
Yeah.
As long as one of them comes home, they're okay.
So it's a risk tolerance type thing,
Yeah.
right? They're probably more confident in others than they are in some of their portfolio, right? But you've got to make the bets because I'm sure is it safe to say that some of the things that maybe they're less confident in end up working out in the long run?
No.
Oh,
I
really?
actually do
Okay.
not see that when they make bets that they can't support, that
okay.
they're successful. I really don't think that that's the case. However, you've got to say, what does success look like for
Yeah.
a venture capitalist? And they borrow money from their LPs.
Yeah.
Their LPs have opinions about how that money should be spent. You might be a loss leader for them.
Oh,
You might
okay.
just be making their annual reports or their quarterly reports look fashionable. You're the pretty pictures that get their LPs excited. And there'll be another one next year. You're disposable.
Yeah.
Okay, now that's the worst
Sure.
that you can run into, but believe me, you can run into that.
Yeah.
So we like to encourage startups to have a picture of what they want from their investors and to be asking questions.
Yeah.
Qualify your investors.
I love that. Great advice. I appreciate not only the inside look into the ecosystems, but also into the investment community as well. I've got time for one more question here, and I'd love to ask you, this is going to be a theme throughout all our interviews today, but where do you see robotics going 3 years down the line? Let's use that as the time frame.
3 years down the line, we're going to recognize that we're growing larger robotics companies and that they're manufacturing here in the US. People don't realize this yet, but we're about to see a massive wave of onshoring and reshoring. But the new companies are not building elsewhere, and it's up to us to support them to continue to build right here.
Love that. I'm excited to see what the general consensus is as we get further into these interviews. In the meantime, though, Andra, I just wanted to say thanks so much for jumping on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure.